most of the people who are early starters have joined us now, and we'll get the seminar underway. My name is John Denham. I'm the director of the Centre of English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, and we're pleased to be hosting this seminar with British Future, and we put out a joint publication today. We've got some great speakers. Sunder Katwala from British Future will talk about the research. Then we have Coddington, James Kirkup, and David Lammy. David is, I think, held up by business in the House of Commons at the moment, but will join us as soon as possible. Just a couple of things to say. The event will be recorded and made available on YouTube as soon as we can after the event. As we go forward, you'll see that there are chat buttons, a chat function for discussions amongst people who are following the event. There's also a Q&A function. If you could use that to pose questions to the panel, that will be very helpful. And there's also the chance there to support questions that you would particularly like to be asked. But it's really helpful if questions to the panel can go under Q&A in case we miss them if they get put in the chat feed. So the background to today is pretty obvious, I think. The Euros start now in the next few days. England play on Sunday. It will be a moment where the nation feels English for a period of time, and yet English identity is also contested. There's been a very passionate intervention from Gareth Southgate, the England manager, in the last 24 hours. Today's focus really starts from football and the Euros and the English football team, but broadens out to wider questions of an inclusive Englishness that doesn't just materialize when a football tournament is underway, but is part of the lived experience of being in England. And that's what we want to explore in the course of this webinar. Well, that's enough from me by way of introduction. I'd like first to go to Sunder, who's going to introduce the British Future research. Sunder.
Thanks very much, John. It's great to be doing this event with you and the centre. Just to introduce the themes of the new report, we called it Beyond a 90-Minute Nation. We think football has been important for national identity, but we want to talk about what needs to happen outside sport as well as inside sport. I think a lot of us experience national identity for the first time through sport. Gareth Southgate's open letter mentions that his first World Cup memory is the 1982 World Cup as an 11-year-old. That's the first World Cup I remember as well. I was 8 at the time. And the positive thing for me when I was an 8-year-old is nobody had actually ever said to me, Sunder, England, Englishness, why do you think it's got anything to do with you? I was just getting my copy of Shoot magazine every week from the newsagent, scouring it. Would Kevin Keegan and Trevor Brooking be fit for the World Cup? That was the key. That was the key issue in 1982. As it felt quite straightforward. And so in that sense, in sort of national identity terms, maybe I was engaging with being English before I was engaging with being British, because the first Olympics I remember was 2 years later, 1984, and you had the Olympic team, Daley Thompson, Tess Sands, Fatima Whitbread, and Seb Coe, all the great athletes. But you're not thinking, you haven't got a theory of national identity, I think, as an 8 and 10-year-old person following football in the Olympics. By the time I was a teenager, of course, I realised that sport and identity were contested issues, but that national identity was more complicated than that. There had been an argument about whether you could be black and British over a period of time, and that the Olympic team perhaps had sorted that one out, but whether Englishness was ethnic as well. That argument happened in football, and I think football made enormous contributions to national identity in our society that comes out in this new research in 2 ways. Firstly, the initial black players, the Cyril Regis generation, Viv Anderson, still true of John Barnes in the 70s and 80s, they won an argument that they were English. And football was it's where I experienced overt public racism of a scale you'd never see today. But it's where I heard about anti-racism for the first time, because there was organisation around football at club and country level to change the culture. But the players won the argument that the England team would have black players, and that if John Barnes scored a goal, the goal counted. Seems a really obvious thing to say, but the NF contingent in the England, as they were saying black goals don't count, they would sing the wrong score when Barnes scored in Brazil. That argument, I think, was over by 1990, and the black players were there. A third of the players who've played for England since then have been black and mixed race. No British Asians yet in the England team. But that won the argument. But that didn't win. That didn't change the argument about the culture we had at football. And I think largely when I was growing up, football was part of the problem of identity. Football was about hooliganism. It was about xenophobia. It was about racism. We were worried about the way in which sport, and football in particular, would represent identity. And yet what this research shows is that football, more than anywhere else, has turned up and decided to be part of the solution of identity. Italia 90 started that. We forget now, Gazza's Tears, Nessun Dorma. English clubs couldn't play in Europe at the time of Italia 90 because of the ban, because of hooliganism. So the sense that, you know, the fans had a travelling culture that was, you know, xenophobic, that was violent, that you'd be singing, you know, if it wasn't for the English, you'd be Krauts. That was there. And then Euro 96 was so important to me personally. It changed how I felt about being English, because we changed the flag to the St. George's flag that summer. We've never quite worked out why that happened. Devolution hadn't happened yet, but we were drawn against Scotland. Perhaps people realise that. But the St. George's flag went with the spirit of Three Lions, which wasn't to say that the the country that had invented the game was so arrogant it would always win. Three Lions is about how England isn't expecting to win, but still remembers that it could happen. And so the triumph of hope over expectation is happening again. So it's a very soft, inclusive, welcome to the world, host the party, be part of the party, be proud of it, kind of Englishness. And I think we've had that in football, in the team, and to some extent in the culture we got in the stadiums, you know, for that period now, for 25 years. And so it's interesting what the research shows. Three things they show, three glass half full stories. It's common sense now that you don't have to be white to be English. Over 3/4 of white English people think that. 2/3 of ethnic minorities, a slightly smaller number, are confident that Englishness is open to all ethnicities. A slightly larger number of ethnic minority respondents, 1 in 5 of our large poll, saying really you have to be white to be considered truly English. So there are a lot of people giving that answer when they regret it, and there's a smaller group giving that answer because they still think it's true, a shrinking group. The caller David had to deal with on his radio show. That's a shrinking group. So that argument has gone. That shrinking group has a lot of profile, has a lot of, we've won that argument. But what is the culture that we want to be? So it's open. You can be English if you want. Do we feel we've got an Englishness that invites us all to be part of it? And what this research shows is that the England football team, for 2/3 of the white population, 2/3 of ethnic minorities, has that status. Here is a symbol of England that belongs to people of every ethnicity and faith. But at the moment, it's the only symbol we've got that we're confident of. We're not as confident about the flag. We're not as confident about St. George's Day. Younger people, younger white people and ethnic minorities are more confident about the flag during the 2 or 3 weeks when there's a tournament on than they are the rest of the year round. But an inclusive Englishness that works when we put flags on our cars and there's a tournament on isn't an inclusive Englishness that we need all year round and in society. So I think the positive story about sport and football told in this research, that we found a symbol and a vision of Englishness where people were being invited and we had a culture being invited. There's a problem here that does not extend outside of the sporting sphere enough. And so I think football is top of this league of an inclusive Englishness by default, because very few other institutions and people have turned up. We're hearing from Gareth Southgate about the story of an inclusive national identity for England as well as for Britain. We don't really hear that enough, I think, from our politicians, from our other institutions. So I think football's done a great deal to give us a glimpse and an image of the England we now are in the 2020s. The team that walks onto the pitch represents that. There are new arguments about racism in sport and in society today, and the team want to be part of those arguments. But football's made its contribution. I think this research shows that we've got to find ways to get an inclusive Englishness happening, not just through our football team, a cricket team, a rugby team, but by the other institutions in England turning up and being part of it. So that's our theme for the research. We're delighted to have other contributions. And David, I'd like to come to you next to share your experiences of England and Englishness and where we are today on that.
Thank you very much, Sunder, and I think it's great that that you and John and others persist at this important issue. I mean, let me just say that I think I agree with you. When I was, coming of age, and watching Viv Anderson and John Barnes emerge into the English football team, the truth is at that stage, I would have thought that Britishness was still contested as an inclusive idea. What I mean by that is that it was understood by those that had arrived from the Caribbean and the West Indies, those that had arrived from the Indian subcontinent and Africa, that they were part of the British Empire. That was understood by them, but I'm not sure it was fully understood by those that lived here, because empire was far away for most working people. People forget that really up until the 1980s, it was unusual for the average Brit to take a holiday abroad, and certainly much beyond France. And so there was something other, I think, about those that came, yes, from the British Empire, but there was little understanding that they were British, and there was certainly no understanding that they were English. And I think the Britishness box has opened up, and it would be interesting to explore why it has opened up, but it's probably because it's always been an identity that's been rather flexible in truth. And somehow the national heroes, particularly the Olympic Games, have played a part in a kind of pride that everyone's been able to feel about that Britishness particularly. And it's fantastic that certainly the community that I'm from is keen to say that they are British overwhelmingly, Black British. Englishness, however, is in a much more dangerous place, and in some senses has gone into a more dangerous place in the sort of meta environment of identity politics, of global economic pressure, of inequality, of working class people wherever they're found in Europe or in the white settler countries of Australia, Canada, the United States and beyond. But in those places, in this age in which the two major economic engines of the world, and I would see that as white working class engines in those countries and here in Europe, and black and brown people in the global south and here in Europe and in those countries. Those are the engines, frankly, that make the goods, that keep things going, in fact. But as those communities have come under pressure, I think, and I'm afraid as populism has grown, however you want to define that, there is an ethno-nationalism that's emerged and that's sort of almost doubled down on. And the truth is, the inclusive Englishness that you describe, and I would actually go beyond an inclusive Englishness, because what I want is what I wrote about in my book was a national civic identity, and to have a national civic identity which is more than just inclusive. Frankly, Sunder, I'm going to challenge you there a bit. That's a little bit tame and terribly English, because you see, what I think we need is nation building. And nation building has become something you almost associate with new countries, like countries that have experienced tremendous pain and hardship, like Germany after the war, or Japan, or South Africa, or, you know, countries that suddenly have new independence, like the Caribbean countries. They're in the business of nation building. And I think the English have got to be in the business of nation building. And if you're in the business of nation building, then your leaders, your political leaders, are returning to these issues on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, are choosing deliberately to identify with cultural events that are inclusive, are building a story within schools and communities that are inclusive, that are in the business of a new national story. And the irony of this moment, it seems to me, following the decision to exit the European Union, is that we have an opportunity to build that new national story, or to renew that new national story. But the danger is that that national story is built on old myths. Now, I don't say that cynically, because the truth is all countries tell myths about themselves. They can be incredibly helpful, but you do need some new ones as well, is the truth. And there's something about Englishness that I think is stuck in two places. And you see it really if you walk into any school and look at any history class, or indeed explore English, those sorts of subjects. And those two foundational stories, I think, that are told is the powerful story of the Tudors, and if you like, Henry VIII's throwing off of the Catholic Church based on his decision to marry different women, basically. But that Protestant story of England emerging into this new place, that's one story, and the Elizabethan era that followed it, and obviously empire that followed that period. And then the second story is winning the Second World War, often told more recently through the lens of Britain standing alone, which is a myth. I mean, it's a total myth. And that you can get away with a Hollywood film that takes Oscars away is an indication of how great our storytellers are, because the United States is probably rather upset that we won it alone. I know we have a modern enmity with Russia, but I think they might be a bit upset that we won it alone. And you could certainly be conscious that my ancestors in the Commonwealth and in the West Indies are rather upset that we're airbrushed out of the story. And indeed, the controversy that I revealed very recently about the contribution to the First World War of African soldiers, so written out the story is that most British people do not understand one jot that there was an East Africa campaign, that as many fell on the Eastern Front as the Western Front of the First World War. It's not taught in schools. People were incredulous that they didn't know this. They thought that what they heard from Sigrid Fasoon and Wilford was it, that the Blackadder story, so wonderfully conveyed, was it. They had no idea that in Kenya and Tanzania, the First World War was being fought as well, with co-opted Africans brought into our ranks to help us secure Kenya and then into Tanzania. And we were very keen as Brits to have this connection from the Nile, Egypt, right down through Africa for frankly, for very important strategic and geopolitical reasons. So I want a civic nationalism. To get that civic nationalism, you need new stories, new myths, to get that inclusive vision. And you need to ground it in some new institutions. They can be old ideas, but new ones that bring about and get that working together. And now, as a starter for 10 in my book, I talked about a civic national service. I want to emphasize civic, but there has to be an element of compulsion. And that is an aversion to people in my party, certainly. But it's really interesting that Macron has gone in this direction, even though it's for a very limited period, I think it's a month in France, because he too wants to tell a different, inclusive sort of story about modern France. I think what emerges with the English team is not that different from what emerged a few years ago with the French team, a team that was so diverse, but personified modern France. Did it lead to a place of inclusivity in France? I've got to say, when I look at those scenes coming out of Black Lives Matter in Paris, I'm not sure it did. So this has got to be a lot deeper than sport. You know, there's been controversy this week, hasn't there, about booing and about taking the knee. And they're always presented in Britain, these controversies that are not, in my view, controversies about the substance of racism, discrimination. They're usually controversies about language and symbol. And I don't actually think that we move very far on when we have those controversies, but it reminded me of the era in which I grew up and in which Nelson Mandela was still in prison, and in which apartheid was still roaring, and in which many people in Britain started in a progressive place but grew to be very different kinds of people in Britain, took a view on what was happening in South Africa and the importance of sanctions. And Margaret Thatcher set herself against that, and others, frankly, saw Nelson Mandela as a terrorist, not a freedom fighter. But what was interesting is that people began to boycott Cape Apples. And they weren't just people in places like the seat I represent. They were ordinary British people that were seeing the scenes on the news, and that was all they could do. And then, of course, we get to a place where the progressive ideal breaks open, that modern values of rights and responsibilities break open. And now, of course, we're in a world where everyone would say Nelson Mandela was a good guy, and people couldn't believe that anyone would be on the wrong side of the apartheid debate. But what I'm saying is, I'm not sure how different that debate, and remember there were cricket teams that wanted to, sport should be different from sanctions, that wanted to play this out. I'm not sure that debate is that different from what we see, what we're hearing this week about taking the knee, or indeed English players that have tweeted previously racist things. So what I'm saying is you've got to go beyond sport. Sport is a signal of what is happening in the country, partly because it's so youthful. It captures where communities are today. But you've got to go deeper. That takes leadership from the top, definitely prime ministers, indicating that this is important. It takes powerful new national stories, and it takes a real challenge for old European countries, and certainly ones like ours that have not been invaded, that have not had those sorts of traumas, yet exiting the European Union does present an opportunity. It is really, in the end, to get into the business of nation building. How do old European democratic powers that are broadly peaceful, how do they climb into the box that is nation building, doing so in a way that is above politics and above partisan politics? Perhaps it is not solely through the lens of governments. It has also, in our country, got to be through the lens of the monarchy. And there we have had signals, certainly from Prince Charles, that he has a vision, and he uses inclusive language, certainly, when he talks about being defender of all faiths. I'll end there.
Thank you, David. Challenge there to go beyond inclusion as a foundation, get into nation building, which others will pick that up. I'm next going to introduce Anne Coddington. Anne leads the journalism and publishing course at the London College of Communication. She's a very experienced writer of books of journalism about women who follow football, about London 2012. And I first met Anne 25 years ago. We were part of a small voluntary group of supporters organising a fans festival interested in this cultural change. Anne, give us your views.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I think I'd like to start by saying Euro 96, I remember it very well. Again, it was one of my first engagements with Englishness. I don't think I'd really thought about what it meant to be English before that. And I can remember the tournament really vividly. I mean, the sun was shining and there were all kinds of people in that stadium. You know, there were women, there were children, there was the sort of the humor, there was the singing Three Lions on the Shirt. And it felt to me at that time, you know, incredibly inclusive. I was sort of drawn into this culture. We were all united by this shared goal of wanting the team to win. And there was a real sense, I think, of belonging about that. And I think as a moment, that's an incredibly potent reminder about what football can do. It's about emotion, it's about feeling. You know, I remember sitting behind in the sort of the England-Germany game, the famous game that went to penalties. You know, I was sitting there with a big strapping scaffolder from Bolton. You know, he'd got tattoos and, you know, he was almost in tears. I can't look at these penalties. And people sort of displayed their emotions, their vulnerabilities. And I think you sort of came away from that feeling that you'd had an experience, a real experience. But I think that is just one moment. And I think sometimes we can think about things like Euro 96 and think, oh yes, that means it's an inclusive Englishness. But actually it isn't. It's the opportunity for something like that. I think it commemorates, or it's an instance of an opportunity, but actually an inclusive Englishness around sport is actually something that has to be built, and it takes an enormous amount of time to build that. You know, if Euro 96 is one moment, as a traveling fan, as somebody who has followed England, you know, for 16 years across 4 World Cups, 4 European Championships, home and away, you know, Euro 96 is one version, but there's another version, and it's about a set of very rigid fans. It's about a fandom that really doesn't want to engage with difference. It's a fandom that doesn't want to engage with women. It doesn't want to, you know, it's about singing 10 German bombers. It's about singing No Surrender. It's about saying that, you know, well, we're just into the football. We don't want to have conversations about anything else, despite the fact that singing 10 German bombers and No Surrender is, you know, has political connotations. And it's about not really wanting to have that conversation about Englishness. So it's a stop, both to a kind of inclusivity, you know, it's hostile, it's aggressive. You know, I remember I've sat down in front of fans who stood up, and I wouldn't dare say, excuse me, could you sit down, please? You know, it's about an unwillingness to have that kind of conversation that I think we need to have. And I think, you know, that's the issue around sport and Englishness, as I think Sunder said and David has said. We can't expect sport to be the sole means of doing this. You know, as we've seen with players taking the knee, it can initiate a conversation. And I think that's really important. And I think that what Gareth Southgate has done is a real aspect of leadership. I think he's really demonstrated leadership in sort of sending out that letter. You know, but sport, if sport is the only symbol that we have of Englishness, then I think that's really difficult, because we have this great, you know, multicultural vision of sport with the footballers, but the fans, it's much more mixed. You know, that the people who come to see that sport, it's a microcosm of what's going on in society, and that's much more mixed, and that's much more difficult. And I think that's why we need, as David is saying, new symbols. Yeah, I think, you know, the St. George's Day, commemorating that, I think that's really important. And I know that it's on a Saturday next year But I think the challenge is to think, well, what are we going to do with that? You know, so we may celebrate St. George's Day, but how are we actually going to do that? And what does it mean beyond saying we're having a day off? You know, I think how we might celebrate that in Tottenham, for example, is going to be very different to how we might celebrate it in Southampton, say, or in Lewes, where I live. But what are those symbols? What are those feelings? What are those gestures? You know, the things that really appealed to me from Euro 96, which was about a kind of authenticity, a feeling of connection. When I think of Englishness beyond the team, I sort of have a bit of a vacant space. You know, I could talk about Monty Python, I could talk about Fawlty Towers, but we don't have a language to kind of talk about those as being English. We don't quite know. You know, I come from Yorkshire and I have quite a sense of identification with Yorkshire. You know, it might be about having a northern accent, it might be about being dour and a particular kind of humour, but I have some kind of connection. When I think about Englishness, I'm not quite sure what it is. And I think that kind of needs unpacking more, and we need more language for it and more vision. And I mean, this is purely anecdotal in terms of teaching at a college with lots of young people. You know, we have lots of people like to talk about identity, like to talk about their sexual identity or race, ethnicity, but not many talk about Englishness. And I think there's a reason for that. They're not quite sure how to approach it or how to unpack it. You know, people talk a lot about Britishness, and I think, as Sunder's saying, things have really moved on. And I think, you know, and I think that's really good. But it's almost like we need more sort of flesh on the bone now to kind of make sense of what it can be and what the potential for that can be.
Thank you, Anne. James Kirkup, director of the Social Market Foundation and a Telegraph columnist over a long period. Tell us how to talk about England.
Thank you, Sunder. To add to my dubious CV, I should add and confess, non-football fan. So you're being very inclusive by inviting me to this event. Thank you. I suppose I'd probably start by returning to sort of the original essay question that we were set for the panel, which is, is football enough, I suppose? And going back to the very good polling that you've published today, bluntly, I think that polling suggests quite strongly that football alone is not enough to build an inclusive idea of England and Englishness, because for all, there's lots of positives in there, and you're right to stress them. You've got non-trivial numbers of people who, on one side, think that England and Englishness is not for them, that they are excluded from it, and you've got non-trivial numbers of people who actually are quite happy to exclude from their idea of Englishness another group of people, often on the grounds of race. So yeah, and that takes place against the background of, I don't know how many, several years, decades even, of visibly multi-ethnic sporting teams and sort of, those occasional signs and symbols of inclusion. So I mean, by self-evidently, football alone is not going to be enough. And I very strongly agree with lots of the things David said. I mean, I will come back to that in a moment. So obviously that raises the question: if that's not enough, what is? I mean, at the risk of sort of questioning the whole premise of the exercise here, why don't we have a look at another country in the UK that actually has managed to develop a national identity that is probably more inclusive without making much use of sport, which is Scotland. I'm almost Scottish. I'll come on to where I'm from in a moment. I think it's very striking that Scottishness is, we can overstate it. Scottishness is probably a more inclusive identity than Englishness, particularly when you look at the experience of Asian Scots. And that's been done without multi-ethnic sporting teams. I think, again, I'm not an expert, yeah, I think there have been incredibly few ethnic minority players in any Scottish national team, and yet Scotland has constructed an identity for itself, which is more inclusive, because, proving the central point I think David and everybody's made, because lots of people, frankly, in Scotland spend a lot more time talking about Scottishness, possibly too much. I speak as a former political editor of the Scotsman. It's possible you can obsess about this stuff too much. But yeah, and this is actually how I came to this debate, I suppose, 15, 20 years ago, writing for the Scotsman and about Scottishness, and actually I used to write more about Englishness for the Scotsman, because actually the Scots are quite interested in the development of English national identity in a way that for many years the English were not, and still to a large extent aren't. So what's the the biographical bit, I suppose. I was thinking about this when you were talking, Sunder. Sunder, you talked about your when you first became aware of England. As a non-football fan of a similar vintage to you, it's a funny thing. I grew up very conscious of the idea of England, because I grew up, I think it's about in a straight line 7 or 8 miles from the Scottish border. I'm from Northumberland. And so by definition, almost, we understood that we were in England because Scotland was on the other side of the hill. Not that there's no hostility there, or I'm from a place of sheep and shepherds, and the sheep wander either side of the Cheviot and the borderline, nobody minds. But we are aware of identity there, because it's quite vivid. I mean, I was back home. I still think of it as home, even though I've been gone 27 years, in my my village last weekend, and the English flag is flying over the church, as it does every day and always has done. Nobody ever remarks about that. That's just a statement of fact. It's implicitly that's there to say it's there because because it's the Church of England, but also because we're not Scottish. And I think that idea, that's one thing. Well, the reason why Northumbrianism I think is important here. If I'll try not to digress into my long-standing view that we should probably go back to the Heptarchy and refound the Kingdom of Northumberland. I'll pass over my historic grievance against the Vikings, but Northumberland is obviously quite a long way away from a lot of the rest of England, where it's about as north as you can go and still be in England. And so I grew up simultaneously aware of being English, and yet aware of a great deal of distance from what I think we probably understood as being the proper idea of Englishness, which had something to do with green lawns and croquet and cucumber sandwiches and possibly cricket, which is played very popular in Northumberland. And I think that is where this conversation needs to go. And it's a theme that I heard from you. Well, I know is present in your thinking on this, Sunder, as an Evertonian. I think, and particularly you mentioned it when she talked about Yorkshire. And I think the question I'm curious to explore here, I'd be interested in other opinions from the panel and the audience, is about plural ideas of Englishness. Because David's absolutely right. In our lifetimes, Britishness has been expanded to take in the hyphen. It has been established that it is possible to be British and something else, and that's generally a positive thing. And yet Englishness is still singular. I mean, for some people, I think Englishness is what you've got if you haven't got a hyphen, if you've got nothing else. It's the identity of last resort, which actually is not that's not a healthy or even accurate way of looking at it, because nobody is only English. Everybody who is even the English not British, a very important group that I know John, you've done a lot of work on. Even the English not British will have other identities, whether or not they're regional identities, whether or not they're Cockneys, Geordies, Everton fans, whatever they are. Everyone's got something else as well. And I think we need to talk more about how we combine our English identities with other identities as well, and not have, essentially bring down the barriers around Englishness, and admit that we have a lot of overlapping and overlaid identities. And football, I think, could be, insofar as I understand it, strange game that it is, could be a way to start that conversation, because it is possible, like you, Sunder, to be a deeply committed England fan, hence the shirt, while also caring very deeply about the progress of Everton. We're all more than one thing, and I think we need to move away from the idea of Englishness as a singular identity, and that can't be done just by the odd sporting tournament, and it certainly can't be done by the odd tea party on St George's Day. I mean, David's absolutely right about the idea of a collective, a wider nation-building effort. I think, to split the difference between that you identified, David, between yourself and Sunder, I think you're right that we should be engaged in a process of nation building. I just don't think we should call it that, or even admit that we're doing it, because that's surely the English way, is to actually do something but not actually make a big fuss about it. And in the instant you actually start saying we're going to build an Englishness, and we're going to define English values, and we're going to have a process of nation building, that everyone will think, oh God, that's not our sort of thing. We should just do it without putting a label on it or a name on it, and we're possibly without telling anybody. So that's my closing thought, I suppose. Let's work out how we can be English and something else. Let's bring in the hyphen.
Thanks, James. So plural evolutionary nation building there. John, the constant theme of this has been sport gives us a moment to have this conversation, but we need to do things outside sport. Tell us what we should do. You're muted, John.
You. So that, yes, I mean, I actually wanted to talk about the many organisations that could help build an inclusive Englishness, but duck it at the moment. Now, the first bit of good news is that Englishness is actually becoming more inclusive of its own accord, despite this lack of engagement. It's already the case that 1 in 3 ethnic minorities not only identify strongly as English, but are proud of it too. The idea that Englishness is closed is wrong, and your own research shows that there's a much bigger potential pool right now of people who say that Englishness is open to all, even though they haven't personally signed up to it as an identity yet. So the scope to do this is huge. The second bit of good news is that inclusive Britishness didn't just happen. It was actively built by people from the grassroots, civic society organisations, and indeed the state, who went out to shape an inclusive national identity. But it was done for Britishness. That shows it can be done for national identities, and it's been done in Scotland, as James has said. Englishness hasn't had the same attention. And the reason we can't be complacent is that Englishness is still contested. Unfortunately, the small number of people who insist on Englishness being white are often reinforced by some on the liberal left, who also insist, in spite of the evidence, that Englishness can only be white. It's critical, I would suggest, that national identities are national and not communitarian. So we have to keep working on that. Secondly, over the past 20 years, identities in England have become much more associated with political positions than they used to be. The more English were more likely to vote Leave, the more British more likely to vote Remain. But I would argue that in a healthy nation, we want these big political debates to take place within shared national identities, not between different national identities. And there's also some geographical and demographic challenges. People who are more likely to emphasize their English identity are more, or live in larger numbers outside the big cities. They're a bit older on average. They're less likely to be graduates than the more British. And again, I'd suggest we don't want to live in a nation in which national identities become markers of a town versus city argument or a red wall against London argument. That would be very damaging. So I tried in my piece to set out 8 principles that I would address to all the organizations in civic society, political parties, institutions, the rest of it, who could be helping in this project. The first one is, if you work in or serve England, talk about England. It's quite extraordinary how organisations, including political parties, will talk about Wales and Scotland, but in England mumble about the country or even Britain. I noticed that Keir Starmer today retweeted Gareth Southgate's article, but Keir Starmer is another Labour leader who never talks about England. In fact, since Michael Foot, there has only been one, and that was Ed Miliband, and he only did it once. And the same thing can be said of other political parties. Now, if England as a nation, which has its own boundaries and its own policies, is marginalised, then English identity is marginalised too by definition. Secondly, promote inclusive images of Englishness. A student of mine a couple of years ago did a survey of local council websites and some national organisations promoting St George's Day events. Nearly every participant was white. This type of celebration of St George's Day is making things worse, not better. Thirdly, tell shared stories. National identities, above all, are the stories we share of who we are and how we came to be here and what we value in common. And we actually need to create the opportunities to listen to each other so that England's story expands to include the stories of those whose families came more recently here, and hear from those of us, most with migrant blood somewhere, who have longer roots in England. So it's a shared story. Fourthly, don't promote or reinforce outdated representations of English identity. Last year, The Guardian illustrated a story about racial violence with a caricature of a skinhead wearing a St George's Cross t-shirt. The Guardian be the first paper to complain about other forms of stereotyping, but didn't mind labelling the 4 out of 5 who feel strongly English as all racists. And it happens far too much. Fifthly, celebrating English identity. I mean, I sort of feel the fact that St George's Day isn't a huge national festival actually gives us more scope to develop celebrations that are inclusive from the outset. And in some of my own work here in Southampton, we've did everything from primary school curriculum work on what modern dragons needed slaying, the local newspaper running a St George's Day Community Award with nominations from all parts of the city, and small grants to community organisations to organise events. You can make these things work. Sixth, not too many more of these, join the local with the national. It's already been mentioned. Most people who feel English often identify strongly as well with a part of England. But because local identities are often shared strongly across ethnic groups, linking the celebration of the local to the national can be a really powerful way of saying everyone who is from here can also be English. And inclusive Englishness benefits all of us. I mean, it's pretty clear from this research that there's a section of the white majority who draw back from St George's Day and the flag because of the connotations that have been attached to Englishness. So actually, by promoting an inclusive Englishness, we can let, if you like, this reluctant group too, to share an English identity. And my final point is, don't be scared. And I mean this because I've had several consultations as director of the centre with major national organisations over the last year that have wanted to engage with England and English identity, but have been fearful that doing so in some way would mean that they were associating themselves with all the negative connotations of Englishness. Well, of course, it's not true. Englishness is overwhelmingly not like that. But the more organisations who engage in this, the easier it will be for everyone to do. So those are my sort of practical thoughts on how different organisations can go about approaching the issue. And now I think with a seamless continuity, I'm going to switch from speaking to chairing the Q&A session. Apologies if I disappeared behind my notes there for a moment. I'm going to, and a quick reminder to people, we're going to work from your Q&A questions, so please do put them in. I'll take as many as I can. I'd like to start with one, and I'll start with Sunder because of the research, really. Two people, John Howarth and Oliver Barrett, and forgive me for paraphrasing, but essentially raised the question of the flag outside us. John Howarth asserts that the English flag has been captured by the far right. It'd be interesting to know if the research really shows that. I always note that, with the exception of the English Defence League, all fascist organisations in Britain have always been British by name and by use of flag. But has it been captured by the far right? And Oliver Barrett's question is slightly differently. Is the fear of flying the English flag because of the association with a distasteful nationalism? Sunder, can you tell us what the research says on that one for a start?
Yes, it's not that it's the far right. As you say, far right groups are tiny. and even at their biggest, they're tiny. It's that sense that it represents something exclusionary, and that the people who like it are not being inclusive. And views are ambivalent about this. It's a flag that divides opinion more. The Scottish and Welsh flags are pretty ubiquitous flags. The British flag has become increasingly so. The Union Jack would polarise people in Scotland. It's the English flag that people have views about whose flag it is and whose flag it isn't. So in this research, we've got during a tournament, and these aren't the highest numbers either. 60% of the white English and almost half ethnic minorities are saying it's good and it's healthy then. But still a quarter saying I don't like it then. And outside of a tournament, at a normal time, we've got 4 out of 10 ethnic minorities and half of the white population. Only half of the white population saying that's a healthy sign of patriotism. So you can see a big part of the white population as well thinking I don't really know what people are doing with that. So I think if you don't normalise it and use it at events across the country to which everyone is invited, some people will always say, because of some of the people who are associated with it, I wouldn't want it to be the thing that we use.
Okay. I don't know if any other panelists want to come in on that. If not, I'll move on to carry as many as I can. This probably one is one for certainly for David and for James, I'd say, to start with. Jacqueline Lansman's question, which is, can civic nationalism be bipartisan to counter, if not beat, the current cultural wars? I think, as I understand that, if we are successful in this nation building or inclusive Englishness, can it take some of the heat out of the cultural wars that we have at the moment? David, could I come to you on that?
For sure. Absolutely. I'm going to tell a little story. I'm not sure if I've written about this, but in the run-up to Gordon Brown becoming the leader of the Labour Party, Gordon was definitely in a consultative mood with members of the Parliamentary Labour Party and certainly with ministers. John Denham will remember this. And I think I can say that one of the things that clearly had come up in some of the focus group work that was being done at the time was there was definitely some raising the fact that he was Scottish. So he was doing quite a lot of thinking about an inclusive identity. And one of the things that I sent up and suggested was that he might consider doing what they do in other countries, which is abolishing the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. That's quite radical. And bringing it into the Prime Minister's office. There are other parts of the world, I think they did this in New Zealand, where the Prime Minister wears that culture, media and sport in their office as a way to celebrate and define a kind of modernity and inclusivity. And in countries like New Zealand, where you want to symbolize that you want to, I'm with a Maori, I'm with a, it becomes quite important. And I sent this suggestion through. It was promptly rejected. But I suppose this was an era in which there was still an understanding, I think, that prime ministers could occasionally sit above the sort of party fray. I don't think we're in that era at the moment. And there's a very strong, I mean, I thought David Cameron could sometimes sit above, he sat sometimes above the party knockabout, when he was hugging a hoodie, or asking me to do a review on the criminal justice. He was sort of sitting above the knockabout. And so definitely it's got to be bipartisan. It's got to feel beyond, it's got to feel grubby to make it party political. And that's why I suggested that it probably needs some relationship with the monarchy.
James.
Yeah, the question: can civic nationalism essentially beat the culture war? Yes, it can, I think, and hopefully it will. It will. But I think that will require, lots of things that David has just talked about. And bluntly, I mean, it probably does require more people in politics as well. I mean, I agree about the need to involve institutions outside party politics. But I think actually what's also missing is a better, more thoughtful, nuanced engagement with this question by people who are in politics, too many of whom are a little bit scared to do. We are still wary of talking about Englishness, and we can see in that, in that vacuum, you can just see how the culture war dynamic is starting to creep in. And so, in the conversations about, I use the term conversation lightly, conversations around England players taking the knee, you can see people who are interested in using this as a wedge issue. It is part of there are people in practitioners in politics, generally on the right of centre, who see English identity, sublimated, unexpressed, as being a key driver of their vote. And I think the challenge is probably more here on, well, there are challenges, lots of people in politics. There are challenges for people on the one nation side of conservative politics to try to rise above that, to try and engage with an idea of Englishness that is more inclusive than exclusive. But also there is a real challenge for people on the progressive side of politics. I mean, bluntly, I think it would be a very good thing if a lot more people in David's party, his colleagues on the front bench and his leader, talked about this stuff in the way that David does. I think it would be better if it was not left to some of these left on the margins. And so also to hark back a little bit to the preceding question about the flag, just a thought experiment, I suppose. Can you imagine what would happen if, in the current climate, if a national politician of either party gave a speech wearing the English flag on the lapel, or in the backdrop of their Zoom screen? I mean, I'm a former, sometimes somewhat recovering journalist. I still commit the odd crime of journalism. I can tell you, I can almost script for you now the op-ed pieces that we've written on both sides of the debate about, isn't it marvelous to see someone flying the flag? Isn't it terrible to see someone pandering to racism? Which is just a miserable, limited dialogue. And we're only going to get away from that when we actually get grown-ups on both sides of the political divide saying, you know what, this is bigger than that. It's about more than short-term point scoring and voting. So yes, I think civic nationalism can beat the culture war, but I hope it will. I don't know if that will necessarily happen. Let's hope so.
Thank you, James. The next one I'm going to put to Anne, I think, from Mark English, which is an interesting one. Mark suggests that most English football fans, leaving aside the minority we've talked about, most fans have sort of got over 1966 and now approach tournaments with a deep sense of foreboding that things might not turn out that well. I paraphrase his question, but asking whether in politics it isn't a bit different, that we're still living on the myth of English or British exceptionalism, which and he suggests therefore it's English football has become more relaxed than the nation has as a whole, and therefore politically we're less likely to be inclusive. Do you think there's an insight there into our difference of national attitude towards football and our national attitude towards politics?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think we don't have the debate about Englishness either. I suppose I think we don't have the debate about Englishness properly, either in terms of football or in terms of outside of politics. So I just think, are we more, I mean, I don't know if I think we're more relaxed. I think there are people within football who think they know what Englishness is. They think it's the flag. They think it's you get behind the team and you're there for the team. But then I think it starts to kind of fall apart, because for some England fans, then yes, they're behind the team when they play on the pitch, but they actually don't like things like taking the knee. Suddenly, whenever somebody doesn't like something, it's about, well, you're bringing politics into it. You know, politics and sport are inexorably linked. So I think, you know, and we see that with things like the taking the knee. Suddenly people don't like it and can be very vocal about it. And I think there are all kinds of aspects of things that we associate with Englishness that are happening within that stadium. You know, so for example, in terms of things that kind of make me feel a bit more uncomfortable and things that are connected to Englishness. So for example, you know, I'm a Republican, and there are times when I don't feel that comfortable about singing the national anthem. But what I don't do is I don't boo, and I respect the fact that other people would like to do that. So I stand up, you know, I gather my thoughts while we're singing, and I, you know, accept that others like to demonstrate their English feeling through that sort of celebration and that ritual. But I sort of, you know, that's not something that I'd like to do. So it is a kind of, it is a sort of opposition, but it's about how you show that opposition. So I think within sport and Englishness, there are all kinds of tensions around what Englishness is and what it can be. But some of them, I think, are far more vocal and far more articulated, sometimes very badly and very loudly, and others aren't. But I think sort of maybe more broadly outside, again, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about quite what it means to be English, but that's also a process. You know, having been in Germany for the 2006 World Cup, you know, I remember German people being really, really hesitant about the flag. Wherever you went, people were saying, "Oh, I don't know, you know, I don't think we want to fly the flag in Germany. It's nationalistic." And by the end of that tournament, people were feeling really rather relaxed about it. And gosh, isn't this great? We can be a country that flies our flag and sort of feels all right about that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to put this next question to everybody, but for brief answers if possible, please. We haven't got a lot of time left. The thorny question of England, Scotland, and Wales. And I won't name all the questioners, but there are three issues coming up here. One is Gareth Young. I haven't seen the poll myself, but says there's a YouGov poll out saying today that there's more support for players taking the knee in England than in Wales and Scotland. So do we beat ourselves up too much? Somebody else has asked whether a problem with Englishness is it has been too much shaped by how people in Wales and Scotland and perhaps Ireland have talked about Englishness. And a third question essentially was about forthcoming games with England and how they may play into this discussion and how Englishness is represented. So please don't try to feel you have to answer all of those, but on the England, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, sounds of those terrible jokes question, who would like to say something? Sunder, I'm going to come to you perhaps first.
Yes, I mean, it is complicated, and you know, Euro 96 just before devolution, I think the English are starting to realise that they've tended to talk about England and British at the same time, and that therefore talking about Englishness is going to take time. I think the reason it matters, national identities matter broadly when they're citizenship identities, but all the ones you give public recognition matter. And so you want the ones that give public recognition to be open and to belong to people. I think we just got to get relaxed from it. We don't speak to people in Wales and Scotland. They would welcome a conversation in England about Englishness that separates it out. I think a lot of people in Wales, Scotland would prefer that the United Kingdom national anthem was used for the Olympic team, and that the English team should also choose something English like Jerusalem because it separates it out. But it's interesting to be a multinational society where most people associate with a couple of flags and do different things with them at different times. I think we should talk about why that makes sense to us in our lives as sporting fans, in our lives generally, so that it's not always that every issue in every part of the UK is a tug of war as to which one you're going to be really in the end, because you could go on for a long time deciding to be both.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly on that point about taking the knee, I think Anne put it appropriately. I don't think it's a new idea for some people to have a view on politics and sport not going together, and it's why I evoked the anti-apartheid movement and the vexed rows that existed about sanctions and whether sport should be played in South Africa in the 80s. It's a similar debate. The question is the booing and how British or English is the booing, and we ought to have more of a conversation, particularly in this era, this social media era, of a sort of a way of behaving where we used to be. Certainly the English were associated with being incredibly well-mannered. That was what being English was about, and that seems to have got rather lost, and I think it'd be rather nice to bring that back. But clearly devolution has created a sort of settlement in Wales and Scotland. And I find it interesting that both in Wales and Scotland, you saw this in their census, but I get a sense that certainly in Scotland, there's a much more inclusive sense of Scottishness than I could ever have expected. And that Sawa is well at home, and people, and there is no sense at all, and I hope this isn't political to say, that the SNP peddle anything in his parents' identity or any sense that he's anything other than Scottish. That's a huge advance, it seems to me, on some of what we're seeing here in England. So we've got a lot to do, and I think one of the questions relates to that devolution settlement. It opens up questions about an English assembly and how that English identity is represented constitutionally. I mean, that's in a way a subject for a separate debate and discussion, but it's a very valid debate and discussion, because all is not well, I think, in the way that settlement occurred and where it's left English identity, and why English identity is being dragged to this place that feels just too ethno-nationalistic.
Thank you, David. James and then Anne.
Two very brief points. One, I just on the original question around England, Scotland, others. I'll just really reiterate earlier on, based on my experience for several years of writing about politics and nations in Scotland for Scots. That there is a much better developed debate and better understanding of questions of Englishness outside England within the Union, and I think that's there's a suggestion made. I think someone made in the chat panel somewhere that there's a hesitancy among English politicians and others to explore Englishness for fear of causing offence, or for somehow that a stronger assertion of English identity might somehow provoke further Scottish nationalism and an advance of the SNP cause. I'm not sure that's true. I think the nature of Scottish debate about national identity is such that if the English were to assert themselves more as an identity, I don't think that would worry or trouble anyone in Scotland quite as much as is sometimes imagined in England. So I think that should be that shouldn't not a concern that should hold people back. I just want to pick up and basically very strongly agree. Sorry to have violent agreement on the panel with what David was saying, which I think followed on from Anne's points about taking the knee. I absolutely agree that somebody should be very strongly, and I may try and do this in a column somewhere and somewhere if someone commissioned me soon, that booing people who take the knee is a fundamentally un-English thing to do. It's not polite. It's perfectly, of course, obviously acceptable to take the view that people should not do that, that you would not want to do it yourself, but expressing that opinion, frankly, in an impolite way, should not be seen as English. And I think Sunder mentioned earlier on. I mean, David not long ago had some experience of this on his radio show when someone called in. David, you remember, you essentially said you couldn't be English, and your reply, I'm sure most people here saw it, was quintessentially English. It was extraordinarily polite and thoughtful and mannered and courteous. And I thought that was the quintessence of an English response to some of the issues that we're talking about here. And I think we should have an awful lot more of that.
Thank you. And I'm going, excuse me if I cut you off, but I'm going to go straight to a quick fire round and then ask Sunder just to make any closing remarks. One of the questions being asked, and I apologize to questioners who I've not got your questions, but the aim of this seminar was all about how do we get other organizations to take up this channel? And one of our anonymous attendees said, how do we persuade civic society organizations and others to overcome their fear of engaging with Englishness? So quick fire round from each person, one idea of something we can do to persuade these reluctant civic society organizations to engage with Englishness. And everyone's now worried that, well, Sunder knows it's going to come to him last, which is quite unfair because he spends his life thinking about these issues. But I'm actually going to go James first, then David, then Anne, and finally Sunder, and to say any closing remarks as well.
Great. I mean, that's good for me because I get the chance to go for the easy answer. Fly the flag. I think doing what Sunder is doing today in the background is perfect. Is perfect, and it's very important for people, bluntly, who have more credibility, more status, more standing among those civil society institutions to do that. So, that probably is a comment. I mean, I run a cross-party think tank, so I usually give advice to people across politics. But in this case, I'm probably talking more to people on the left than the right. But I think people on the progressive side should be more willing to fly that flag and say, you know what, this is, I'm English. This is Englishness. It's okay.
Fly the flag, David.
Well, what's happening is getting better. When the Sun is doing a double pager on an inclusive Englishness, something is happening. Participating in this event has reminded me about my LBC show, and on Saturday I texted my producer while I was speaking and said, can we do an hour on Englishness? To which he said, great idea. Now I said, don't worry, I'll get Sunder or John on to kick off the debate. I think it's Sunder's turn because John did it last time. But it would help if I had a voice that was against. And this forum has largely been a forum of shared minds. So we do need the counter argument that somehow Englishness is a limited identity. What's happening here? This is all very woke, because it generates a discussion. And I think we're on the winning side of this discussion, but we've got to have the discussion. So I need your help with that. But I think we should be more optimistic because something is happening.
Thank you, David. Anne.
Well, I think we need to update tea and cake, basically. English tea, slice of cake. Let's have a street party, and let people bring their different foods. Let's join together. We can fly the flag. We can talk about it, but let's do this updating. There are some good traditions around Englishness, but they need to be updated. Yes, we can have tea, but we can have other things. Let's try different types of tea. Let's bring people together to share things. And I think it's that kind of sharing in communities with people that you don't know. That's what's powerful about sport, is it brings you get to meet all sorts of people that you wouldn't normally meet in everyday life. So we need more forums to do that are actually located in communities and are not just on social media, where we share our culture, we share things with each other, we share food. Those, I think those can be really powerful.
Thank you. And Sunder, and with the thanks to you for the research that has prompted all of this, but your thoughts.
Anna's got it exactly right. The answer to the question is to go ahead and do it, and it will go better than you fear that it would, and you will be surprised by how that works, but you have to get over the fear to do that. We actually asked the question in an earlier piece of research, why doesn't more happen on St. George's Day? And people feel it should. And there were two less popular answers that were popular with a particular group. That rejectionist minority that want it to be exclusive, resentfully said, we're not allowed to because of the ethnic minorities. And then the liberal sort of quarter of society, the most popular answer in that group was nobody cares. And you think, well, someone else cares. But the most popular answer was things aren't organised. Nobody organises anything. And so there's a large sort of armchair willingness that isn't going to go and organise a street party, but would come along. And then it's very interesting if you say, of course, we could mark St. George's Day as well as St. Patrick's Day in England. Let's keep marking St. Patrick's Day as well. Let's do St. George's Day and invite everybody to the party. Some minorities are surprised that they're welcome to attend. Some of the majority population are surprised that the minority population will turn up. And so there's reassurance in the fact, because it's a contested identity, it turns into meaningful contact. We need organisations, we've got a lot of bonding in this society. We need organisations to overcome the fear and offer to be the bridges in our society to make contact on the issue where it feels like you might be nervous of it. And it's very English to feel nervous about people you don't know, and then to find out that it can work. So I hope people will get in touch, John, with you at the centre, with us at British Future. There are examples locally of people who've done that. I live in Dartford, where this is done very, very well for St. George's Day, as it is, John, where you were in Southampton. But other people are not doing it because they think it might kick off. And actually, people are surprised and reassured and happier when it turns out that we do want a party we can all be invited to.
Sunder, thank you very much. That's a great note to end on. Thanks to all the participants. I'm sorry I didn't get through all of the questions. There's some great stuff on the chat as well. To David, James, and Sunder, and all of you who've taken part, thank you very much indeed. And we'll post the video as soon as we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.